Father Terence Curley, and continuing to talk about the mystery and the meaning of grieving in our lives. And I say mystery because it certainly is a great mystery that we're able to go through it. And we don't go through it alone. And that's what's really important to realize. We go through it with others, but we also go through it with the grace and the strength and the resiliency that we need. And that really is something that we've seen with many of the tragic events that have happened in our country. And we realize that whether it's what happened to us in Boston or any place else, that there's chaos, but there's also great resiliency. And the survivors have certainly shown that. They've shown a sense of meaning and the whole message of meaning and hope for all of us as they continue their lives and live lives of hope and continue to, I'm sure, struggle with many of the losses, but certainly at the same time finding meaning and communicating that to their family and their friends. And so we continually pray for all of those who are going through grief. An area that I think is of great importance to all of us, and whether you're a grandmother or a grandfather or you're a parent, is how do we really approach children and loss? Are we afraid to say the right thing or the wrong thing? And what do we really do? Well, I think that we realize now much more as I look at the study from the Mass General and Harvard Medical School back in 1996. I realize that there's so much more we know about children and how they actually process loss and how they go through loss. This is very evident in many fields in art therapy because they don't always have the emotional language that they need. I remember when and art does that. Art's a medium to communicate their losses and how they go through it. I remember when I was really first writing about grief and working on grief, there's a wonderful book that is still with us very much from the Society of St. Paul. It's called The Ministry of Consolation. And my hope in that book was to create a bridge between the experience of loss and the rituals to the whole experience of faith and trust and finding meaning. And over the years, I've thought about one of the examples I use in the Ministry of Consolation. In the parish, and a grandmother died, and the mother came to me and she said, I don't know what to do about Danny. He's crying a lot, and then he plays, and then I hear him crying in the other room. Well, of course, as you know, children grieve intermittently. They do all sorts of things that we don't expect them to do. And they wonder about life and death and eternal life and heaven. They wonder about all of that. But the way their minds work, they do this intermittently because through play they find meaning in the expression. And their world is a lot different. Their worldview is probably the backyard, all right? And they don't have the ability to run away from things, create a necessary diversion for all of us, get in the car and take a ride or go someplace, take a walk. They can't do that, so they have to play, all right? And that's how they really process, according to their psychological abilities in development, So children in grief is something that has to be included, that we tell them stories and that we show them how we really believe and what our hopes are. And that's what I think is so important to emphasize. And the new approach does help us considerably with that. Now with Danny, what I did was I went to the house and I talked to his mother, who's a nurse. And I had a good conversation with her. And I said, well, why don't you try to think about something to do with art with him? All of you who are grandparents out there know especially about the artwork, and parents do too. And it's all over the refrigerator with magnets, the pictures and all of the things that we see in the kitchen. The children love to draw. And they draw, they're expressing who they are in nonverbal ways, but in ways that are healing and hopeful. And I said to his mother, I said, well, why don't you have Danny draw some pictures? That may help and make you feel better about his awareness about his grandmother's death. The mother's a nurse, as I said, and she was very good. She didn't say, oh, God took him. Because if you say, God took him, well, God did that. Why would God take my grandmother? Why would God do that? So there's the attributing of the causes. And really what she did was she said, well, Nana couldn't stay any longer because her heart just couldn't beat. She was too sick. That's what we call a secondary cause, but it's also the primary cause for the loss. The understanding about that, we all revert to this when we think about grief, and I talk about this with my students a lot. I say, well, if Father Curley was crossing the street, and we were going to talk about that, and he's crossing the street and got hit by a car and died, they'd say, in a biblical sense, they'd say, well, Father Curley died because the hand of the Lord touched him. They wouldn't go through all the secondary causes because God is the primary cause. But God works through nature. In reality, I was hit by a car, but God wanted me, all right? So we do that in order to explain causality. But for a child, it's like everything's the primary cause. And for us, lots of times it is too. But in reality, as we realize, God works through nature. So what I said was to have him draw some pictures. He liked to draw. And he was about, I would say, about 8 or 9 years old. And so he drew the pictures. And he drew, interestingly enough, I went back later and I talked to her. And I talked to him later in church and everything too. When he came to Mass, I'd say, how are you doing? And I saw your pictures and they were really wonderful. And he liked that. Because the pictures that he drew was, first of all, he drew a picture of himself and his grandmother together, as only children can draw, all right? I thought that was a beautiful picture. Then he drew a picture of his grandmother alone, which was interesting. And then he drew a picture of himself alone. But the picture of his grandmother alone was a happy picture. Now she was in heaven. And the picture of himself alone, sadness, but realizing the happiness that his grandmother's in heaven. See, he went back and forth. He went back and forth. And that really communicated so much about a good way to grieve. It's good grief in that sense. It actually is. It's wonderful grief because he was able to do that. And he can always look at that, refer back to that for the time being, that he needs to do that in order to remember someone that he loves so very much. So when we talk to children about grief, we should be talking about their prayer life and about talking to their grandmother and saying prayers before they go to sleep at night and doing all of that. That's really important. Those moments of ritual in the home are very important. Or a picture of Nana, or a picture of Grandpa. I mean, all of these pictures are very important, not just to keep a memory alive, but to keep a relationship alive. That's what really matters. You know, some people say, well, we're just recovering and adjusting to a memory. Well, it's far more than that. Our reality is that we're not annihilated. We continue, we cross over the threshold of the waters of death and enter the kingdom of heaven. The love that we have, as we say in the Vigil Mass at the death of a Christian, only your good deeds go with you. But we go, and we enter into the glorification of God's presence. That's what we're glorified. That's what really matters. That's what our hope is, that we share in a similar type of resurrection to the Lord. I was reading something about the study that was done at Mass General, and this is what's interesting about our understanding about grief that's changed, and with children especially. It says each of us looked at data from our respective research. These are the researchers. And we realized that we were observing phenomenon that could not be accounted for within the models of grief that most of our colleagues were using. All right? It appeared that what we were observing was not a stage of disengagement, which we were educated to expect, but rather we were observing people altering and then continuing their relationship to the lost person. Isn't that an interesting observation? From this came the continual bond. Remaining connected seemed to facilitate both adults' and children's ability to cope with loss and the accompanying change in their lives. These connections provided solace, comfort, and support, and eased the transition from past to future. And that's from Continuing Bonds, New Understanding by Grief. And that's a wonderful book. It's hard to get right now because it's a technical study, but it is the framework for a lot of our understanding about how do we relate to children? How do the rituals relate to children? And you have to think of it developmentally. For a child, there's still, when they're younger, they think it's reversible. If you use the wrong words with children, if you say, well, Grandpa went to sleep. Well, they're going to say, when he's going to wake up. That's how they think. Or they went away. When are they coming back? All of these things, you have to speak very concretely and very directly. Excuse me. And they even have what's known as magical thinking. They think, well, I didn't kiss Nana goodbye, and look what happened. They blame themselves. So we have to hear their story. And we have to help them to facilitate ways to tell their story, whether it's with art, or whether it was with play, or whether it was with any other means. That's what's really essential, and that's our hope.